Nights like these only made it worse. The house was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the groan of old wood leaning in the frame, and my husband Samuel was away again at some conference in Chicago. I never thought I'd feel this way. An ache so deep, so hollow, that it seemed to echo in every quiet moment at 34. I wasn't old, not really. This time around, his absence was as consistent as our hallway's ticking clock. He hadn't touched me in weeks, and he hadn't given me the same look he used to. After all these years, I told myself I didn't mind since it was simply a part of marriage, but in reality, I felt invisible. I assumed tonight was no different. I had been mindlessly pacing the house in an attempt to kill time. I reorganized the spice rack for the third time this week, folded unnecessary laundry, and did anything else to keep my hands occupied and below me. Yet, but no matter how hard I tried, loneliness always found a way in. The bed had been my haven during these times, a place where I could curl up with books or binge-watch old movies. But as I sat on the edge of it, the mattress shift lifted awkwardly beneath me. Before I leaned back and the bed frame broke away with a loud crack, I didn't give it any thought. My heart leaped as I fell to the ground. I lay there for a time, half laughing, half startled, amid a maze of cushions and blankets. "Are you? How are you?" Laughing at the absurdity of it all, I abruptly halted upon realizing the bed was irreparably damaged. His voice startled me, and when I looked up, I saw my stepson, Adrian, standing in the doorway. He was 19 years old, and he was no longer a child. In fact, he had matured into a man over the previous few years. He was tall, lean, and had a confidence about him that Samuel had never experienced. He was dressed in sweatpants and a loose t-shirt, and his hair was slightly untidy, as if he had just gotten out of bed. His presence unexpectedly filled the room. "I'm fine," I said quickly, sitting up and washing my face. "The bed recently broke." The yearning breath was drawn as I waited to see what would happen. He then entered the room and looked about at the damage. His face wrinkled. "For example, you can't sleep on a frame that is fully shot." "You can sleep in my room," he offered in a nonchalant, almost matte. "Let me have the sofa." "I'll work something out," I mumbled, embarrassed by the circumstances. "I'll take the sofa," he said. I paused. Strangely, it felt improper to invade his personal space, but I had no other option. "Do you really believe I don't want to kick you?" He shrugged and replied, "It's okay. Get out of your bed. For one, the couch works well." I grabbed a pillow and a blanket before he turned back toward the hallway, leaving me alone to gather my belongings. My mind was racing as I followed him down the hallway to his room, which was cleaner than I had anticipated, with the bed made and a subtle cologne scent permeating the air. "I hesitate. Tell me if you require anything to do," I said. "Thank you." He answered, "No problem," standing awkwardly like a visitor in my own home. "I'm taking an additional blanket out of his closet. Please let me know if you want anything else." I nodded and watched him go. Without him, the room felt too quiet, so he gently closed the door behind him. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands in my lap and inhaled deeply as the stillness became almost unbearable. Just one night, I reminded myself. Though it was a strange detail to focus on, I couldn't help but notice the slight warmth where he had been sitting moments before as I lay down with the sheets cooling against my skin. It served as a reminder that this wasn't my bed or my space, so I closed my eyes and forced myself to fall asleep. However, my thoughts would not stop. They kept returning to Samuel and the growing gap between us, as well as to the way Adrian had looked at me tonight. His presence was unexpectedly grounding, and I rolled onto my side in an attempt to push the thoughts away, but he re-Samueled in a hushed voice. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey," in a low voice, as I turned to find him standing there once again, his figure framed by the hallway's dim light. The sofa was all I could think about. "Not comfy, isn't it? The bed is large enough for us to share if you'd like." He didn't say anything offensive in his tone, But the offer itself seemed laden in some way, so I gazed at him, not knowing how to react. Perhaps I was projecting. My personal burr. He nodded before entering and shutting the doorway as he awaited my response. I inquired whether you were sure. At last he nodded, entered, and shut the door by himself. It's not a huge problem, I agree. He climbed in the mattress and I moved to make room. We lay side by side with cautious spacing between us, lowering beneath his weight, but the tension was evident. Neither one of us spoke. I found myself focused on his steady, regular breathing, matching it to mine without realizing it. At one point, I shifted onto my side and faced him, even though he was facing away from me. Despite the darkness in the room, his face was softly shadowed by the dim streetlights outside. He appeared almost serene. In a way I hadn't seen before, he seemed vulnerable. Without thinking, I reached out and softly touched his shoulder. He startled, but didn't draw away. Rather, he looked at me, his eyes glinting in the low light. With haste, I withdrew my hand and apologized. With a steady stare, he murmured quietly, "It's okay." The silence between us was thick, with unsaid words. Before it began, I knew I should turn away from whatever it was, but I chose not to. If you believe that's where it stopped, you couldn't be more mistaken. The sound of my words went unnoticed and unseen, since, at the time, I wasn't thinking about Samuel, the repercussions, or anything else, but the way Adrian was staring at me, as though I wasn't invisible after all. I'm still not sure how to explain what occurred next, but I do know that it changed everything. The sound of the bed frame collapsing beneath me wasn't just loud. It was deafening for a brief minute in the oppressive quiet of the home. Another thing broke, another thing falling apart in this house, another thing that I couldn't seem to fix. I tried to lift the frame, pushing against the uneven tilt, but it was useless. The damage was irreparable. I sat frozen among the mess of sheets and splintered wood, a startled laugh escaping my lips before it was swallowed by the stillness. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical, but it carried with it a sense of deep frustration. I collapsed on the edge of the mattress, which was now cocked uncomfortably toward the floor, and buried my face in my hands, exhausted. The oppressive silence in the home made me think of all the ways I had lost my visibility in my own life. But it was not consoling. Samuel had left as usual to go to work. The bed had been the one place that still seemed like mine, a place to curl up and escape, but now even that had turned against me. "How are you?" asked him at first. His voice, however, surprised me and broke through my mental trance. "Are you okay?" With a start, my heart continued to race as I looked up. Adrian was standing at the entrance. His figure, silhouetted by the warm glow of the hallway light, had changed significantly since he first began coming over during his school breaks at the age of 19. No longer the awkward boy I knew, he stood tall, his broad shoulders surprising me with their commanding presence. He was wearing nothing but his bare chest and a pair of loose basketball shorts. For an instant, I felt a surge of something I couldn't identify, but I immediately pushed it aside as soon as the light caught it and highlighted the slender definition of his muscles. My voice sounded more fragile than I had intended, and I made a feeble motion toward the catastrophe in front of me. "I suppose I'll have to spend tonight sleeping on the couch." With a worried frown, Adrian moved closer, saying, "There's no way you can take my bed from the couch." "I couldn't," said hastily. Even though it was the only workable solution, the sofa is acceptable for one night. The thought of entering his personal space seemed terrible. The corner of his mouth tugged at a little grin as he shook his head. "It isn't okay. The home is as ancient as that item. There will be no sleep for you." After a moment of hesitation, he said, "Don't be worried about me. I'll take the couch." My mouth opened. I wanted to object, but his look stopped me. For someone his age, he suddenly exuded a confidence and ease that I wasn't used to witnessing. It was disarming and nearly convincing. in such a way that it was difficult to disagree. "Are you certain?" He nodded when I replied in a calmer tone, "Absolutely. Come on, I'll get a blanket." Before I could reply, he vanished down the hall to the linen closet. I tried to get rid of the weird sensation that had descended over me for a while as I sat there. Even though I told myself it was simply a bed and a kind offer from a good lad, my stomach churned with an unexplainable tense energy as I packed my things and walked down the hall to his room. Not unexpectedly, his room was tidy. The bed was well made, the navy blue, her beats were smooth and welcoming, and I noticed that his fragrance was a delicate blend of cedar wood and another warm, spicy aroma. Feeling like an outsider in a place that was so clearly his, I stopped at the doorway. He replied, "Come back with a blanket folded over one arm and point to the bed." "You own everything. Let me know if you need anything." I replied with a barely audible voice, "Thank you." With a nod, he walked out of the room, gently shutting the door behind him. The mattress was firmer than mine, and the cloth felt cold against my skin as I perched on the side of the bed, feeling the weight of the day bearing down on me. I laid back for a while. The bed still had the subtle warmth of where he must have been sitting only a few seconds before, and the notion unnerved me as I attempted to calm my mind. Despite its innocence, the detail had a very personal feel to it. The blanket was pulled up to my chin as I rolled onto my side. Now that the room was dark, save for the dim illumination from the streetlights outside, which produced shadows, I closed my eyes and wished for sleep to arrive, but my mind was a thief, straying. When I turned around, I saw him standing there once again, framed by the faint hallway light, startled by the creaking sound of the door. "Hey," he said, his voice low. I was apprehensive since I thought the couch wasn't very comfy. "Are you okay?" I gazed at him, trying to read his expression, and my pulse raced if he didn't continue the sentence, but the words remained unsaid. The way he stood there with his hand on the doorframe was not very provocative, but it was clear that his eyes were vulnerable. "Do you mean it, Lillian?" With a little shudder in my voice, I inquired. He nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Yes, if that is okay with you." I moved aside to create space, and he snuggled in next to me. The mattress sagged beneath his weight, and I felt a sudden sense of alertness. We lay there in quiet, keeping a safe distance from one another, but the tension was evident. His fragrance was stronger now, surrounding me in a way that was both reassuring and unsettling, my heartbeat becoming faster with every breath and more audible than it should have been. His back remained to me as I rolled onto my side and faced him. I could feel the warmth coming from his skin since he was so near. I could see his shoulders rising and falling steadily and the way his hair hung just over his brow. And then, as if by chance, his hand briefly touched mine while passing by. I froze, gasping for air as he said, "Sorry," in a voice that was almost audible. But neither he nor I moved away. Instead, we silently acknowledged something that neither of us dared to name. What followed would upset the delicate balance of that night and lead us to a place from which neither of us could return. But I still question whether it was truly inevitable or if we decided through the air. And the space felt dense, even oppressive. In Adrian's bed, I had been lying. The blankets clung to me as if they knew what was going on in my head, and for what seemed like hours, I was unable to fall asleep. My body hurt from restlessness, my mind was too active and noisy, and every little sound in the house seemed to be exaggerated. All of the wood's creaks and the ancient pipe's moans mutter into the void. The damaged bed in the other room wasn't the only thing keeping me up at night. Tonight, the home seemed to be enveloped in an odd tension that seemed like a string that was too tight and about to break. However, the silent worry in Adrian's eyes when he glanced at me earlier was palpable. The faint scent of his cologne, which lingered on the pillow beneath my head and seemed to wrap around me like a second skin, was evident in his eyes as he voluntarily offered his bed. I had changed into one of my older nightshirts before bed, a loose, warm garment, and shifted again, turning onto my side, the cool fabric of the sheets rubbing against my bare legs. It was not very comfortable, although it hung just over my knees. The room was now completely dark, save for the dim glow of moonlight coming through the curtains and creating gentle shadows on the walls. I stared at the shadows, attempting to concentrate on their shapes rather than the knot of tension that was forming in my chest, until I heard the floorboards outside the door clang and creak softly, and I heard my breath. The door slowly opened, letting the dim hallway light flood the room as I turned my head toward the sound, my heart thumping dully in my chest. There he was, Adrian, standing there in a loose t-shirt and boxers, his hair slightly tousled, his expression caught somewhere between hesitation and resolve. "Hey," he said. He spoke in a whispery tone, as if he didn't want to break the delicate silence of the night, and I raised myself up, leaning a little on my elbows. "What is the issue?" There he waited at the doorway. He murmured, "It's the couch," as he entered the room at last, one hand clutching the frame and the other hanging loosely by his side. "I don't find it very comfy," he smiled a little sheepishly, which had always made him look younger than he actually was, but now it felt different, less boyish, more vulnerable. With the blanket gathering around my waist, I finally sat up. "Oh," I responded, lowering my voice a bit. "Will you?" His head nodded. His words stumbled over themselves as he interrupted me before I could continue thinking. "If it's okay with you. There's a large bed here, so I can sleep too. We'll both fit in." Despite the fact that there was obviously nothing wrong with his offer, I was hesitant to accept its implications. It was not as if he was making any suggestions. After all, we were both adults. The way he stood there waiting for my answer made my heart race, even though it was improper. "Yes," I eventually answered, my voice more steady now. "Of course it's fine." The lock clicked loudly as he moved farther into the room and gently closed the door behind him. He walked across the room with a smooth, unhurried gait, lifting the edge of the blanket and slipping underneath it on the other side of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight, and I became acutely aware of every change and every sound. He settled onto his back, his head resting on the pillow a foot or so away from mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the only sound in the silence between us was the sound of our breathing, mine shallow and uneven, his deep and measured. I turned onto my side and faced him, but he kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The soft light from the window cast shadows over his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the curve of his cheekbone. There was something about the way he looked tonight, calm, steady, and completely captivating. Despite telling myself to look away, I was unable to do so. "Are you okay?" I murmured, hardly raising my voice above a whisper, and he turned to face me. Then in the low light, his eyes met mine. "Yeah," he whispered quietly. "Are you?" I nodded, but I wasn't certain. There was a tense feeling. I was unable to identify it, but I was also unable to ignore it. His eyes stayed on me for a minute. His palm brushed against mine under the cover, the contact so light. He searched for a while, as if he could see right through me, and suddenly it occurred so little, so delicate, that I nearly told myself it was an accident. It may have been nothing at all, but I sensed it, the warmth of his flesh on mine, and it made me feel energized. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "She's safe," I whispered, easing his hand back a little. The tension between us intensified with each passing moment, and despite my voice being audible, my heart pounded in my ears. Despite the fact that neither of us spoke or moved, the weight of the situation was indisputable, and every instinct in me cried out for me to break whatever it was. Before it continued, but I was unable to. I was immobilized, ensnared in the heat emanating from his body so near to mine, and he reached out once more purposefully this time, his fingers brushing the back of my hand. It was such a small, simple thing, but it felt like everything had changed. Beneath me. Instead, I let the touch linger, letting the quiet linger as his fingers intertwined with mine and my breath caught in my throat, and rushed until I finally ventured to say Adrian's name. It felt heavy and strange on my lips. He eventually glanced at me, and I could tell by his focused yet gentle gaze that there was no turning back now. Whatever was going on between us, neither of us could control it. I couldn't help but lean into it, though, since I wasn't simply a mother lying in bed with her stepson at that moment, even if my heart was pounding and my mind was screaming with 1,000 unsolved problems. I was someone who had been deprived of the warmth, connection, and essence of life. And what came next would make me question everything I believed to be true about myself. But for the time being, in the quiet intimacy of that moment, all I could do was hold my breath and wait for the thread to break. The room felt impossible, as if the walls had moved closer, trapping me in a place I no longer recognized. Every breath I took felt heavier, and the air was thick with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Adrian was only a few inches away, and his presence was impossible to ignore. His steady breathing filled the silence I wasn't ready to witness. My eyes lingered on the ceiling. My mind was racing, but every thought kept returning to the same unthinkable reality, that we were in the same bed together. There was obviously nothing improper or fundamentally wrong about it, but the way my heart pounded in my chest told me that this was anything but normal. The faint light coming through the curtains was creating broken patterns above us. My head turned. He was lying on his back with one arm casually slung over his chest and the other resting next to him on the mattress. His shirt had run up a little, exposing a thin strip of flesh just above the waistband of his shorts. I could barely make out him in the dim light. It was a little thing that I ought to have overlooked, but it made me feel something deep inside. I turned onto my side, moving slowly and carefully as if I were afraid to upset the delicate balance of the moment, and I found myself examining him more intently. His face was calm, his eyes closed, but there was a tenseness in his jaw that revealed his own restlessness. There was a calm confidence about him that felt both unnerving and alluring. I pondered whether he could also perceive the enigmatic energy between us, akin to static electricity. I told myself to close my eyes and stop thinking and looking, but my body had its own agenda, betraying me with every quickened breath and slight shift that pulled me closer to the line I shouldn't cross. Then he moved. It was slight at first, a slight turn of his head, a slight shift of his arm, but then his eyes opened and he found mine in the dim light. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick and heavy. In a low, nearly whispery voice, he whispered, "Sleep?" using words we dared not pronounce. "No," I said, my voice hardly audible. He lay on his side. Then the air itself was filled with a tension that made my skin tingle. His eyes searched mine, his expression opaque, and I felt my breath stop in my throat. His face was now only a few inches away from mine, matching my posture. After a while, in a cautious but earnest tone, he replied, "I don't want this to seem strange." "It's not," I stated. His smile was weak, but it came swiftly, even though the words sounded empty to my own ears. "Good," he whispered gently, with a slight knowing twist of his lips that made me tremble. "I like having you here." I was unsure of how to react to that. Words weighed heavily on me, hanging in the air. My hand, which was resting close to the edge of the bed, twitched uncontrollably, as if it wanted to reach out and close the impossibly small gap between us. The room gradually shrank until it seemed to encircle just the two of us. The warmth surged through me, causing my cheeks to flush. His eyes flickered to my lips for a brief minute before returning to my eyes in a delicate movement. almost imperceptible, yet it started a domino effect in me that Adrian was unable to prevent. I began, a little shaky in my voice. "Yeah," he answered in a kind, almost friendly manner. I couldn't find the right words. They were caught between my thumping heart and my intended message, and my rational side, which was telling me to stop. But then his hand moved just enough for his fingers to touch mine. It was a gentle, hesitant touch, but it gave me a shock I couldn't ignore. My fingers twitched again, and this time his hand followed, curling ever so slightly around mine. The contact was so slight, so innocent on the surface, but it carried a weight that neither of us could deny. Neither of us pulled away, and the silence grew heavier as the air around us became thick with something unsaid. Almost whispering, he continued, "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." "I don't," I said. The words came out before I could change my mind, and his hand tightened slightly around mine. His touch was warm and solid. "Good," he said, his eyes searching mine as if seeking permission to reassure me because I was afraid I didn't know what to say or do. Emotions swirled around in my head. I felt breathless as fear, guilt, and longing collided, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. All I could think about was how his touch felt, and how his presence seemed to fill the room and fill the empty spaces inside of me that I hadn't even realized existed. I turned my hand slightly, my fingers entwining with his, in a way that felt inevitable and natural. Both of us remained still. The uneasy quiet between us was gone. His gaze softened and his countenance transformed into something I couldn't quite pinpoint, yet felt deeply visceral. However, the world outside the room vanished, leaving only the faint rhythm of our breathing, perfectly in time. And I moved closer without thinking. It was a slight, tentative movement, but it was sufficient to bridge the last distance between us, and his hand moved to rest lightly on my arm. The room was charged with possibilities that neither of us dared to express. His delicate yet forceful touch caused my determination to completely collapse. How did it happen? Would alter everything. But as I was laying there in the silent closeness of the night, I was just thinking about how his touch made me feel, and not about the possible outcomes or outcomes. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to stop. The night wasn't yet finished, and as I lay there with my heart thumping in my chest, I understood that this was only the beginning. I felt alive in a way that I hadn't felt in years. What followed would disprove everything I believed to be true about him, about us, and about myself. Silence pressed on your ears until you couldn't ignore it, and the night was unbelievably silent. I was hyper-aware of everything, the quiet rustle of the sheets, the faint hum of the heater in the corner, the steady rhythm of Adrian's breathing next to me. Despite telling myself not to look at him or allow my eyes to linger on the shadowed contours of his face or the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. The room felt different now, as if the air itself had thickened and was enveloping me like an invisible veil. However, like so many other things tonight, my willpower seemed to fail just when I needed it most. With one arm carelessly stretched over his stomach and his fingers playing aimlessly with the blanket's edge, he was resting on his back. The dim light from the window kissed his skin, bringing out the delicate curve of his lips and the sharp lines of his jaw. I kept staring at him longer than I should have, gasping when his head twitched and his eyes locked with mine in the darkness. "You haven't fallen asleep?" he murmured in a low, whispery voice, and I nodded, unable to speak because his stare was so heavy. But I couldn't take my eyes off of him. There was something in his face that was unsaid, something that reflected the tumult of feelings swirling inside of me. I thought he might say something else, but he moved closer instead, causing the mattress to dip under his weight. His sudden closeness made my heart race. He was now so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and his subtle cologne scent teased my senses. "Are you okay?" he inquired in a softer, almost hesitant voice. "Yes," I said hastily, but my voice sounded shakier. His eyes wandered over mine, and his brow furrowed slightly, as if he didn't believe me. Then, before I could comprehend what was happening, his hand moved slowly and deliberately, as if he was giving me every chance to pull away, but I didn't. His fingers lightly touched mine, sending a chill up my spine. His hand lingered there, exploring the boundaries of what we both understood to be an unspoken line. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "You're not," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His hand moved again, this time with greater confidence. As his fingers slid between mine, a surge of heat surged through me, building up in my stomach and radiating outward until I felt as though my entire body was on fire. I should have retreated. I should have spoken up and taken action to stop this before it got any worse, but I was unable to do so. Instead, I placed my hand in his, our fingers entwining in a way that felt impossible to be personal. For a minute, neither of us said anything, and the stillness between us lingered, heavy and heated, full of everything we weren't saying. My mind raced with 1,000 ideas, 1,000 reasons why this was a bad idea, but for now, none of them mattered. He shifted once more, his free hand landing lightly on my arm. His touch was steady and warm, and it gave me another chill as his thumb slowly and deliberately brushed against my skin. My breath caught, and I could feel my resolve eroding with every second that went by. "Adrian," I began, but the words died on my lips as his eyes met mine once more. His gaze was so intense that it seemed like it was dragging me down. "You can tell me to stop," he continued quietly, his voice containing hesitancy as well as something deeper that I couldn't properly identify. I remained silent. He leaned in slightly, his face so close now that I could feel the warmth, and I let the silence speak for me instead. I let my head tilt slightly so that I didn't pull away, and I said everything I couldn't bring myself to put into words. His hand moved again, sliding down my arm to rest just above my wrist. The heat of his touch was almost overwhelming, and I felt my skin tingle in its wake. The faint scent of him filled the air between us, a mix of cologne and something uniquely him that made my head spin. My heart was thumping so loudly I was positive he could hear it, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his hand moved again, sliding up to cup the side of my face. The sensation of his breath against my cheek made every nerve in my body tense, and every sense heightened to a degree I didn't know was possible. Everything else vanished for a minute as his fingertips brushed my cheek in an unbelievably delicate manner that made my breath catch. My eyelids drifted shut. House the night. The world beyond this room. I had never felt more alone in my home, and in my life I don't know what this is, he said, his voice gruff and low, but it seemed as though he thought he didn't have to continue the statement. Since I felt it too, I understood precisely what he meant. His eyes scanned mine as if seeking permission for comfort, and I found myself nodding without even realizing what had happened. He hesitated, then his palm was still on my face, his thumb making slow, methodical circles across my skin. A tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered a single, haunting question as I leaned into it, allowing myself to be carried away by the wave of emotions I could no longer ignore. What happens when the sun comes? What comes next? Next was unavoidably the culmination of every unsaid word, every stolen glance, every charged moment, and every stolen glance that had brought us here. The night went on forever, and every second was measured by the rhythm of my own heartbeat rather than the ticking of the clock. I was awake and conscious of everything, including the weight of the silence, the heater's faint hum, and the gentle rustle of sheets as we moved ever so slightly, but none of it was louder than the sound of my thoughts slamming into each other for space in my already overflowing mind. I couldn't recall the last time I felt this alive. It was difficult to ignore the symphony of feelings that filled my body, as if every nerve had been roused and was firing in perfect harmony. My world had shrunk to this room, this bed, and him. Adrian's presence was magnetic, drawing me closer, even as my rational mind cried out for distance. He hadn't moved much since our fingers had intertwined earlier, but the weight of his gaze lingered on me, heavy and unrelenting. I tried to focus on the ordinary, on anything that could ground me to reality, but nothing seemed to hold. The way he gazed at me wasn't the only thing. He had dark, inquisitive eyes that seemed to pierce every barrier I had painstakingly constructed, exposing me in a manner I hadn't been in years. "You're quiet," he resamuled quietly, his voice resonating throughout still water like a ripple. He shifted slightly, propped up on one elbow to face me more fully, and I nodded, my throat too tight to form words, his lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that the subtle scent of his cologne sent a chill down my spine. The sincerity in his voice surprised me, and I felt my determination wane even further. "You don't have to be," he said in a low, tempting tone. "Not with me." Every fiber of my being was telling me to stop and leave, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was this far gone, Adrian. I began, my voice shaking as I forced the words out, wanting to believe him and allow myself to lose myself in the solace he was providing. But I knew that nothing about this was straightforward. "We just cannot." He interrupted softly, his gaze never leaving mine, and his tone was one of calm inquiry rather than rage or impatience, like he really wanted to comprehend. "I don't get it, yet you keep saying that." I wanted to answer him and tell him all the reasons why this was wrong, but I couldn't find the right words. His question lingered in the air, and I felt my heart thumping terribly in my chest. I couldn't even begin to explain how I could make him realize the unseen boundaries we had already passed and couldn't return from. His smile softened when I eventually confessed, hardly raising my voice above a whisper, and he stretched out a hand, grazing my face in a sensitive gesture that made my breath catch. His touch was warm and grounding, and I briefly let myself lean into it. Sometimes it's all right to just let his words break something inside me, something I hadn't even known I was holding on to. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the night bearing down on me. "You don't have to know," he whispered softly, his thumb moving slowly in circles across my skin. When I opened my eyes and looked into his eyes, I realized that the pull between us could not be undone. It was too powerful, too indisputable, and I was too worn out to continue fighting it. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to stop him from pulling away, but I remained motionless, my heart thumping in my chest as his lips touched mine in a whisper-soft kiss. The world seemed to stop, the air around us charged with an unavoidable electricity, and I felt myself melting into him, my hands finding their way to his shoulders as I clung to him, as if his touch was the only thing keeping me grounded. His touch was firm but gentle, and his hands sliding down my back in a way that sent shivers through me, causing every thought, worry, and doubt to fade into the background in favor of the moment's overwhelming intensity. It was more than simply a kiss. It stood for everything. All the unspoken words had reached their peak. A tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered a single haunting question, even as I allowed myself to become engrossed in him. Every lingering glance and every moment of tension that had developed between us over the past few days was the answer to a question I hadn't dared to ask, the release of emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel. And what comes next? I noticed a glimmer of doubt in Adrian's eyes as he drew back a little, pressing his forehead against mine as we regained our breath. It seemed like he was waiting for me to say something to reassure him. "Are you okay?" His voice was filled with real worry as he inquired quietly. Though the reality was far more nuanced than that, I nodded. There were moments when his arms were about me, and his lips were still tingling on mine, and I didn't care whether I was all right or if I would ever be okay again. "Okay," I said in a barely audible whisper. "I'm fine." He smiled, then a genuine, true smile that made my chest hurt. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I allowed myself to think that perhaps, just possibly, this was my destiny. However, as the night wore on and the first signs of light appeared through the curtains, I started to doubt that. The persistent sensation that everything was about to change, that what we had done was irrevocable, and that the repercussions of our actions were just a short distance away, persisted. When the sun rose, would we pretend this had never happened, or had we stepped over a boundary we could never unstep? As I lay there, his hand was still entwined with mine, but I had no idea. One thing was clear to me. Nothing would ever be the same again. Another joyful,